Welcome. I am Sanho Tree from the Institute for Policy Studies, and on behalf of IPS and the Washington Office in Latin America, I want to welcome you here today. We have a presentation from Catherine Lederber, who is director of the Andean Information Network based in Cochabamba, Bolivia, where she's been living for the past 18 years. So we hope to get some context and background into the current affairs that are and U.S.-Bolivia relations today. Catherine actually got her start here at IPS as an intern back in 1989 and has lived in Bolivia for the past 18 years and observed the political developments there with a special focus on drug policy and alternative development and human rights. And, you know, in the United States, we have very shallow news coverage of what's happening in Bolivia. It's either portrayed as, you know, a puppet of Venezuela, and that Evo Morales is somehow a finger puppet of Hugo Chavez, or that this, you know, crazy indigenous leader is going to nationalize every rock and stone in the country. But in fact, there's a lot more context that is not talked about in this country. So with that in mind, Catherine, could you explain some of the basic background to this issue, and what are some of the misconceptions that we get in the United States about this issue?
Well, I think that people probably know more misconceptions than they do about the actual dynamics in Bolivia, and that it's a very, very complicated situation, that Bolivia has a very unique history, and that many of the issues and the initiatives that the Morales administration is promoting or advocating today are demands of different social groups and long-standing demands and issues that were pending, and not necessarily the specific agenda of the Morales government. And I think one of the main misconceptions here, where there's a tendency to oversimplify, is that I've heard over and over that Evo Morales is a puppet of Hugo Chavez, that they're imposing Chavez's agenda in Bolivia, and it's certainly, once you live in Bolivia on the ground, a very, very different issue. First, I think it's important to note that the way that politics work in Bolivia are extremely unique, and impositions don't really function in any case. The bulk of the population is indigenous, approximately 70%, although figures differ. The large part of the population is quite poor. But within this group, there are many, many other different groups and with different interests who consistently pressure the government and pressure other governments to enact change. And the Morales government came to power in a point in time where the traditional parties that had ruled the country since the return to democracy in the early 1980s had become discredited after a series of corruption, of inefficacy, of problems with allowing excessive influence on the part of the United States government and direct intervention, especially within the framework of drug policy and Coca leaf eradication. And this very, very complex inherited situation has led to very, very complex dynamics within Bolivia. But the turn that policy takes in Bolivia and the dynamics within Bolivia largely have to do with problems that are internal in Bolivia. External actors have a determining role to a certain extent, but I would say that influence of Hugo Chavez, although there is funding and things, is limited, and that there is a difficult situation for the United States, which had a great deal of influence in the past and was able to impose policy. And we've seen that the U.S. has increasingly lost ground in Bolivia, and that the weight of their funding, or the importance or the weight that they could throw around with U.S. funding, has diminished significantly. And I think that that's an important shift and something that we need to understand very, very closely. Thank you.
Well, can you explain the significance of the election of Evo Morales? Explain who he is and why it's important and why this is significant in a country like Bolivia.
Evo Morales is an indigenous person. He is of Aymara descent. He grew up in the highlands in Oruro, and as a teenager migrated to the Chapare Coca growing region. The Chapare Coca growing region functioned as an escape valve for population that didn't have sufficient access to land, for miners that were fired as part of reforms imposed by neoliberal institutions, and in the Chapare coca growing region, this union structure of the rural areas and the union structures of the miners was used to organize different sindicatos and groups in order to settle in the region. Within that region, at that point in time, there was no government presence, and so the union fulfilled the role of the government. It established education, established public works. There was a system of self-governance and law enforcement, and a very, very high level of organization. As this is a region where the coca leaf was always traditionally grown, but with the increase in the demand from cocaine, largely from the United States and then later from Europe, coca producers began to respond to that demand and increased their coca crop. At a point in time when the U.S. decided to identify drug use or the war on drugs as a national security threat, the U.S. began to intervene directly in Bolivia and focus on attacking cocaine production and coca production in the Chapare region. As the focus turned increasingly to attacking farmers, and these are farmers that are growing the coca leaf for subsistence, U.S. pressure became increasingly intense and violence escalated. It is within this framework that Evo Morales began to earn experience in the union structure as a union leader, resisting significantly and with other coca growers, U.S. imposed policy, U.S. imposed forced eradication, human rights violations, and an attempt to totally eradicate the coca leaf through violent means. At the same time, as Morales began to function as the leader of the union system with many others, they decided that direct action was not enough in order to articulate their interests, and they began to also work on the political level. And they worked very, very hard to gain seats in Congress, initially 3 seats, after that 7 seats, and now, of course, they dominate one house of Congress and have almost a majority in the other. And so this dual strategy of political organizing within the system and direct pressure and protest outside the system in order to change policy, and because within the system the government of Bolivia at that time basically did what the U.S. wanted to in order to obtain funding, is what strengthened Morales' political base. As these groups, the traditional parties, continued to be ineffectual, and it became increasingly clear that, especially in the area of drug policy, that it was the U.S. that was calling the shots, the erosion of their political legitimacy became evident, and this exploded in the end with the killing of 70 people protesting Gonzalo Sanchez de Rosada's policies in 2003 and demanding a fairer share for all Bolivians of the revenues from Bolivia's national gas, that led to the beginning of a period of transition. It's important to note, I think, how strong U.S. pressure was at that time. During the 2002 elections, the U.S. ambassador said that U.S. would cut off all funding if Bolivians voted for Evo Morales. And at that point in time, his percentage approval rating in the polls went from 14% way up to the point where he lost that election by 1.5%. And when he finally is elected, it's with 54% and a mandate that then is confirmed with 67% later. So there is a process of change that's going on in Bolivia that has to do a great deal not of a violent takeover or imposition or Chavez's support, but an erosion of legitimacy and a lack of responsibility on the part of the traditional parties and the traditional government, and a systematic intervention on the part of the United States and a desire to control the direction of Bolivian politics and other things that have brought Morales to power, and that he is viewed with legitimacy by the great bulk of the population.
So for the first time in how many centuries there's an indigenous ruler of a Latin American nation? I mean, this is quite a phenomenon, right? And what kinds of issues is he trying to address? What are the reforms that are causing these impasses right now?
Well, the reforms that are causing these impasses are all things that were agreed upon before Morales' election. One is a constitutional assembly or a redrafting of the nation's constitution, which has been a demand of indigenous peoples in Bolivia for over 15 years. the nationalization of the hydrocarbons industry, which was done quite early on, because previously the Bolivian people received, or even the Bolivian government, only 18% of oil and gas revenues. There's been a shift in that, and Bolivians now receive the majority, but the struggle is between, will the central governments or the states, the departmental governments, have greater control over the royalties. Another issue that had been pending in Bolivia since the early 19th century is the issue of autonomy. Autonomy for lowland departments that wish, and the focus initially was for greater decentralization. These regions are lowland regions. They're very, very different culturally. They're very far from the capital, and they were frustrated initially with the need to go in the capital and the central government's control over every aspect of governance. This is something that has been a legitimate demand in the past. But since the shift and the agreement for a direct election of prefects, which happened in 2005, before Morales' election, there was no change with the decision to directly elect the prefects.
Explain who the prefects are.
The prefects are the same as regional governors. They'd be the equivalent of state governors in Bolivia. But the problem is that they were always appointed by the central government in the past, leading them to be corrupt, ineffectual, and in fact, the going commentary in Bolivia was the idea with having a governor is somebody there who wouldn't spend the budget so it could revert back to the central government, and the president could spend it on something else. So the idea of having these people popularly elected is a good idea, but at the same time, when they chose to do that, they didn't change the legal framework. There was no new regulation between the central government and the departmental government. There were no transparency guarantees in place. And so a lot of these things and these reforms that were carried out before Morales came to power created gray areas and a lack of clarity that have become battlefields during this administration, which has nothing to do with the actions that are carried out by the Morales government for the most part. These new governors, the opposition governors in the lowlands, in a referendum that occurred the same time the Constitutional Assembly was called, they opted for departmental autonomy. The problem was, in this referendum, you opted for a departmental autonomy that was to be defined in the text of the new Constitution. So there's no clarity about what form that will take until the constitutional draft is approved.
Now, can you give us some context in terms of the role of race and wealth, land distribution, and how that plays into these issues?
Well, I think that those issues are key, and there are issues that in Bolivia had not been significantly addressed in the past, although they were in the 1952 revolution. A lot of time has passed. There was an agrarian reform in 1953 in the highland regions that broke up the larger properties in the haciendas, and distributed it amongst the families that worked that land, and that had there was a shift in the power base and a disintegration of the landholding elite at that point in time in the highland regions. And some of those people were able to reinvest and became industrial elites, and other people blended into the middle class. At the same time that happened in the highlands, there was no significant shift of land tenure or no application in the lowlands. And in the lowlands, the rural population is smaller. The indigenous groups that existed before the conquest were not organized as part of empires or communities that the Spanish could easily govern from the top down. They are largely underdeveloped regions, although Santa Cruz developed a great deal because of the oil industry, and there were large tracts of land that were in the hands of few people. This was something that was exacerbated beginning in the period of the Banzer dictatorship in 1970, and through other dictatorships and traditional parties who usually distributed to their cronies tens of thousands of hectares per person as gift. Of course, these are hectares that have indigenous people living on them and already campesino communities, but what you saw in the period from 1970 to approximately 2002 was a further concentration of land in very few hands. And what I'm talking about, for example, in the Santa Cruz family, is a concentration of the majority of land in the hands of 16 families. and with no title, with no claim, with no purchase for these large tracts for the most part, and no logic of working the land or providing benefits for the people or compensation for the people who lost it. So an agrarian reform process that was implemented and had difficulties in the highland never happened in the lowland. Ironically, there was more agrarian reform legislation passed in 1996 by the Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada government. What the Morales government has done, and what scares the highland elites that don't have a legitimate right to the land, is that they've drafted legislation that's almost exactly the same as Gonzalo Sanchez de Lozada, of a neoliberal government's legislation, but the concern is that they're actually going to implement it and carry it out, and there's a huge difference there. And one of the reasons why the struggle for autonomy of these lowlands, and it's a struggle for autonomy that's also led by the lowland elites, the families that are the highland leaders, the industrial elites, and the urban, because when you peel away the urban population and this very wealthy section, and you look at the election results both in the 2005 election, but also in this year's recall referendum, it's even more clear. Peeling away the urban areas, rural support and support of low-income people still is firmly in the hands of the Morales administration, who they are. Although but there's a pattern of constant criticism and reevaluation on the part of all Bolivians. There's the feeling that Morales most closely represents their interests, and they continue to support him.
Now, in this struggle between the lowland elites and the national government, the U.S. ambassador has been caught up in some controversy of late. Can you explain some of the context behind that, and what claims are legitimate about the role of the U.S. ambassador and his responsibility for this situation, and what's been exaggerated?
Well, I think that it's important to highlight again what I talked about before, the definitive role of the U.S. ambassador in the past, the control they had over withholding funding, specifically through the anti-drug certification process, the amount of pressure that was exerted, the role of USAID specifically in the Chapari and other regions in the past, implementing development policies, but that also had the objectives in them implicit in dividing coca grower unions, weakening the union structure, with a political orientation and a great deal of conditioning on, for example, elimination of total coca production or adhering to other U.S. requirements.
I'll just ask you to stick in there something about the centuries of growing the coca trees long before this became part of the drug world, because it's very important.
Mm-hmm. The distinction between coca versus cocaine, which is lost on people in the United States very often.
Lost on people. It's like this suddenly happened, 20 years
ago. When Americans started using cocaine, yes. Coca leaf has been in Bolivia and in the Andean region for centuries. I'm not sure exactly how long it has existed. It has been a traditional part and an essential part of not only Andean communities' daily use, but also spiritual and ritual use. It is something that is considered legal in Bolivia. It is considered legal in Peru. It was something that was taken advantage of by the Incans as one of the measures of trade and use. It's used in every Andean exchange in terms of establishing reciprocity, religious ceremonies. It's an excellent appetite suppressant. Imagine how well that would go over in Los Angeles. It helps with stomach ailments. It is something that is a mild stimulant. Chewing coca leaf is very similar to having a cup of coffee. So you can imagine what we would all do without our coffee. And I think Sanho has spoken in the past about studies of what Americans have done in universities when they did block their coffee consumption. The coca, it's fascinating. One of the things that I like to highlight is that in Bolivia, with the arrival of the Spanish, seeing the key role of the coca leaf, they began a campaign, their own forced eradication campaign, and this was part of their strategy to eliminate Andean religions and colonize, and it was a very concerted campaign, and it lasted for several years until the Catholic Church realized that the tithes that they were receiving from the coca leaf because it was essential for the miners to take out the silver leaf were almost as much as they were receiving for silver, and they backed down. So, the survival of the coca leaf and coca leaf use is something that this is not the first time it's been attempted to be eliminated for the wrong reasons and misunderstood, but it suggests that coca growing and coca chewing will always persist.
And the use of coca, particularly at those altitudes, when the Spaniards discovered silver, that's when they reversed themselves, right?
Well,
it's difficult to mine at 14,000 feet without coca.
Well, without coca mining, and not only at 14,000 feet, but if you understand that the indigenous miners were sent down there for 48-hour periods, week-long periods, with very little food, that was the only way to have the stamina to do that. It's fascinating the parallels that exist today when you tour an eradication camp where the Bolivian military is pulling out the coca leaf, and at the peak of forced eradication, when the U.S. funded program was zero coca and total elimination of the coca leaf, you would go into eradication camp and there would be coca drying beside every tent. And I asked the commander, why is the coca drying here? You don't expect those soldiers to have the stamina to pull out that coca leaf without chewing coca. And this highlights what an integral part of Bolivian culture it is. I think it's fascinating. I remember in the periods of time in the Chapare where there were confrontations and blockades, and the security forces would be with automatic weapons on one side, and coca growers would be with sticks and stones and slingshots on the other side. But yet both sides were chewing coca to carry on the confrontation. And so this is something that continues to be consumed by almost every Bolivian on a regular basis, be it by coca chewing or coca tea, and a series of other uses. So there is a very important legal, traditional function, and this is something that the Morales government is focusing on as well. Let's make a clear distinction between coca, the leaf as a natural, healthy product, and cocaine. And we want to permit coca, and we want to be able to use coca traditionally and find out exactly how much coca we really need for that. And that's part of their agreement is we want to carry out a study, and it's funded by the European Union. Let's see how much coca we can consume legally, and we'll limit ourselves to that, and then focus very clearly on eliminating the part that's linked to the drug trade, although that is, of course, very, very difficult.
And coca in its natural state is almost impossible to abuse in the leaf form, right? I mean, I've tried shoving giant wads of coca in Bolivia where it's legal in my mouth just to see if I can get some kind of different effect, and it's actually quite mild. Trying to compare the effects of coca leaf to cocaine is like trying to compare the effects of coffee to methamphetamine, in my opinion. It's so mild, and yet the U.S. has this obsession with wiping out coca. And that's one of the things, of course, as you said, led to the popularity of Evo Morales, was the drug war backfired on us. But under Morales, with the yes to coca and no to cocaine policy, there is more coca being planted, but interdiction of cocaine is doing quite well, isn't it? I mean, it's much better than
yes. The increase in interdiction is notable. Now, there are some people who will say that's because there's an increase in cocaine, but there's a focus of the Morales government on attacking what they call the illegal part, and in order to do that, they've accepted, unless you believe what they say in the Washington Post or the State Department decertification decisions, they've accepted to work closely with the Drug Enforcement Administration, still, of the United States, in order to show and to demonstrate that there is a very clear desire to eliminate this portion. Now, there's not more coca being grown than there was during forced eradication, because it's important to note that, the more coca leaf they pulled out and without any effective alternatives being provided, and the U.S. Ran these programs and structured them in a way that they were political and that they didn't provide any economic income, coca was replanted. It was replanted in the Chapare, it was replanted in other regions of Bolivia, and it was also replanted in Colombia and Peru. The balloon effect that we talk about, that all of these repressive policies have served to move the coca leaf production all around the Andes, but no real reduction. So at the same time we talk about what those policies didn't do, it's important for us to talk about what they did do in the past, and that's generate poverty for these families who are looking for subsistence, generate a great deal of human rights violations and accompanying impunity in these human rights violations, and a further erosion of these countries' national sovereignty, a lack of legitimacy of elected leaders, a direct relationship between U.S. government officials and the Bolivian military that almost always went around civilian governments. So one of the things that I think we need to look at is in a yardstick of policy and looking at Morales' policy compared to forced eradication is not only what does it do, but what does it not do. And what it doesn't do is force eradication. What it does do is carry out negotiations where the families themselves and the unions are in control of limiting the amount of coca. They're permitting more coca to be legally grown, but it's important to note that the amount that they're permitting is still smaller than the amount that has existed in the past. And people aren't getting shot and people aren't getting beaten up. And the most important thing, I think, is that people can eat with a small amount of coca that guarantees their subsistence, because I think that coca production, at the end of the day, for coca growers is about school supplies and dinner on the table.
Now, Bolivia is one of the, if not the poorest country in South America, right?
Mm-hmm.
Talk about the level of poverty that we're talking about amongst these peasant farmers, these coca growers, and what does growing legal coca mean for them in terms of food security and how much are they able to make growing this minimal amount of coca?
Well, it's important to note that the Chapare is a semi-tropical region. The soil isn't that rich. There's not good road infrastructure, although there is better than some places. And at the point in time where there was forced eradication, we're talking about the bulk of the family's income eliminated in one day, and access to development age that, for example, orange tree plants that then would give fruit in 8 years, and no good plan to what to eat in the meantime. And at that point in time, you saw a great number of families take their kids out of school because they couldn't afford the books or they couldn't afford the shoes for their kids to walk several miles to school. The amount of coca that's permitted now, which is called a cato, it's about a third of a U.S. football field, and that generates from between $80 to $120 a month for these families, and it makes all the difference in the world. And we're talking about people who live very, very simply, who live in wooden houses, who sometimes have electricity or not, but that are able with that amount to survive, and also ironically able to take risks to branch out to grow other things besides rice and other products that they've always grown, because if you know that you're going to have something on the table, it's not as scary or risky to try something else.
It's a difficult concept to communicate to an audience in Washington, D.C., the term food security, right? For us, food, we think of, it's a question of where shall I have dinner tonight? What shall I order at the restaurant? Not if I will have dinner tomorrow night or the night after, or if I can feed my family. And so the ability, once there is food security, many things are possible, and the local economies can be diversified, right? And I remember visiting Villa Tunari in the Chapare with you back in 2003, and I remember how poor it was in the infrastructure, lack of economic activity. But under the Morales reforms, there was a new bank, an ATM machine in the middle of this very rural area, and people were starting to diversify. Can you talk about the kinds of activities that are happening?
Well, the kinds of activities are happening that some people are able to buy used vehicles for public transportation. This means that people have money, for example, to pay a small amount for a school bus or a taxi to take their kids to school so they don't have to walk 2 hours each way. It means that there's more money for health care, but at the same time there's been a great improvement in health care, one from national government money in the construction of a hospital, but also from the presence of Cuban doctors. And it's important to note the ironies in the Chapare before the U.S. spent just to feed the eradication forces in one day what it would take to build a school or a health post or pay the salary of a doctor for 2 years. It was interesting, at the peak of the violence, there was no anesthesiologist in the Chapare, and as we used to like to say, you didn't have to get shot by the military, you could fall off a ladder and die. So access to health care, transportation, improvement in schools, ability to buy school supplies, ability to buy things they couldn't buy before, like cooking oil and sugar and other luxury items, the ability to have a party at your wedding, the ability to go to Mass, the ability to go into Cochabamba, and for some people to buy a truck, or communities to buy a truck, so that you can take your product directly to market. Because for a very long time in the Chapare, for example, people who were growing oranges in remote regions, 100 oranges sell for 35 cents. And so quite often these people who were trying to produce fruit and sell it it would cost more to take it to market in the nearby city than you would make, and people would end up with debt, and they let their fruits rot in the field.
Mark Raskin, you have a question? I'll paraphrase for the microphone.
Could you take us back to World War II and at least the claims of some in the American government that there were uranium mines there in Bolivia, and that the important thing to do was to control those uranium mines, and that the way to do this would be with the American military, perhaps backdoor with the government set up there. But that the major issue, at least during that period, related to the uranium mines. Were those mines, do they work?
In reference to the presence of uranium mines and the U.S. interest in them, it's my understanding that there are uranium mines and there is uranium. There was a big hullabaloo on the part of some people in the United States when Bolivia established diplomatic relations with Iran last year, saying that it was the Iranians and their nuclear policy. But there is uranium, but it's not useful in a nuclear capacity. And so I would say that there was probably a U.S. strategic interest, but my idea about the U.S. and what they've been up to for a very long time is a way to maintain influence, a way to direct policy, a way to maintain control, and a way to have a very close relationship with the armed forces as a guarantee for the interest in their policy. I mean, it's fascinating that the U.S. has just decertified Bolivia for not doing what it wanted to in the drug war. Ironically, they were going to certify him. This is largely punishment for the ambassador, but the money is still flowing. And at the same time, only 1% of the cocaine produced in Bolivia even arrives in the United States. Most of it goes to Brazil. So how do we understand this huge U.S. apparatus and with this bilateral spat that made U.S. policymakers furious, the expulsion of the ambassador, of the money still flowing to address a drug problem that is largely affecting the Brazilians and the Argentinians and the Europeans. I think there's this need for the U.S. to intervene, the U.S. to maintain weight, and the inability for the U.S. In a real way to understand how much ground they've really lost in Latin America and specifically in Bolivia.
The issue of mines, though, is a very interesting one. When I first started to learn about Bolivia, I was amazed at the role of the mining industry, and particularly things like silver, just the mountain of Potosi. Can you talk about the history of mineral exploitation in Bolivia and the way it's been exported out of the country, and why that plays into this outrage about the previous government's plan to sell their natural gas, the hydrocarbons, at bargain basement prices?
Mm-hmm. Well, the silver mine in Potosi was the largest silver mine by far in the Spanish colonies. It's important to note at the peak of the mining that Potosi had a population larger than that of Paris at that time. And it was certainly an extreme flow of silver out of Bolivia to Spain, and Spain's own inability to administer its economy meant that silver flowed to the rest of Europe, and this was the beginning of an extractive policy that continued in Bolivia for centuries, sometimes through the tin mines and the tin barons, the different families that controlled this, and how the money flew out of the country with very little benefit internally. For example, the Patino mines, and now the Patino family resides in Europe. It's interesting to note that, once again, the coca growing is another raw material of which the Bolivians and certainly the farmers enjoy no added value. They're not the people who are making the profit. And the natural gas industry was the same case of government elites cutting a deal. These were agreements. The most recent contract signed under the government of Tuto Quiroga, whose father was an executive for Pemex, and they had very close relationships and a lack of responsibility or investment in Bolivians' well-being. 18% was such a ridiculously low figure, and the foreign investors in Bolivia recognized that. In fact, when the Morales government passed the nationalization decree and shifted the great bulk of products of profit back into the Bolivian state, the foreign investors stayed because they realized it was a cost of doing business and they had something that was too good to be true. The suggestion of pumping gas through Chile after the loss of the seacoast in the Pacific War, the Chileans took away Bolivia's only piece of seacoast, is something that really has had a deep impact on the Bolivian psyche and the way they identify themselves. If you think that they only had a coast for 50 years of their existence as a nation, and we still have Bolivian Sea Day, and we mourn it and we remember it, and we still have a Bolivian Navy that didn't have very much to do before the U.S. invented a role for them in the drug war.
And so the nationalization then of the hydrocarbons, of the gas and oil, what does Evo Morales want to do with those revenues, and what do the governors who are in opposition, what do they specifically want to do with those kinds of revenues? They want to keep it for themselves, or for their regions, or for their private own?
Well, this is one of the issues, and this is another example of those gray areas and a lack of clarity that was created before Morales came into power. There was, after the expulsion of Sanchez de Lozada, because of the protests to ship gas through Chile, Bolivia's traditional enemy, a lack of consultation of the people, and the killing of over 70 Bolivians in the process, for which Sanchez de Lozada is facing homicide and genocide charges, but is now living in the United States. There was the decision to shift some of the profit back, and an establishment of the distribution of royalties, giving the bulk of the royalties to the departmental governments. And this is something that had been historical in Bolivia, but with the great increase in the amount of oil and gas revenue coming in, the amount that these departmental governments received was so large without any transparency or any strategy or any very clear guidelines beyond some very vague supreme decrees of how they needed to invest it. I think that there is consensus across the board in Bolivia that that the amount of royalties going to the departments, one, it's an inequitable distribution between the different departments, but at the same time, it doesn't give enough money to the central government to do the things that it needs to. It's important to note when we talk about the departmental governors, and the U.S. refers to them as the opposition, that they're supposed to be carrying out public works and building bridges and administering hospitals. But the salaries and the different staff is supposed to be paid by the government, and there wasn't enough money coming in. As the Morales government decided to take away a portion of the income from this direct hydrocarbons tax in order to create an old age pension, which provides approximately $25 a month for Bolivian senior citizens, this created a great deal of friction with the departmental governments. It was something that was done without much explanation. It was something that was done through supreme decree and not the Congress, and it created a great deal of discomfort. But at the same time, the revenues of those departments had increased more than tenfold in that period of time, and so it wasn't much of a real loss. This is one of the issues that have set off protests and violence and friction, and I think that it's important to note that the hydrocarbons tax, the different autonomy issues, and all of these things are used as issues to protest against the Morales government, but these protests have gone far beyond specific demands that could be addressed within the Bolivian Congress by negotiating on the pending draft of the new constitution, which in fact those lowland elites have attempted to block, as opposed to direct protests. And what they seem to be more interested in doing is actually eroding the legitimacy of Morales and trying to push him out of office.
So then this current diplomatic impasse where the U.S. ambassador Goldberg was declared persona non grata by the Bolivian government last week now, I guess, and then the U.S. reciprocated by throwing out the Bolivian ambassador from Washington. What is it that the U.S. ambassador is specifically alleged to have done, and what do we know about those facts?
Well, I think, the Bolivian government, what they cited was direct support on the part of Ambassador Goldberg and direct support of USAID to the departmental prefects, and then the idea that this support and that this relationship had strengthened the prefects in an effort to directly undermine Morales. In terms of USAID actions, what we know and what we don't know that much, because USAID systematically has blocked any meetings for people like us with its contractors. There's information on the website, but there's a total lack of transparency about what USAID is doing with the departments. We know that USAID funded a meeting of all of these governors to come up to the United States, the opposition governors and the MAS governors. We know that USAID, through the Office on Transition Initiatives, gave money to lowland and other governments, which one lowland government official described as wonderful because it was incredibly flexible and they let us do whatever we want with it. So what we can prove in terms of documentation is very little. The impression, and I would say it was the general impression on the part of all Bolivians, those that support Morales and those that do not, that the U.S. had a close relationship with the departmental governors. It's certainly something that they were able to monopolize, and that the amount of U.S. attention that they were given allowed them to grow and create. If you have someone who's supposed to be building a road or placing gravel or putting in sidewalks, meeting with every U.S. official that comes into the country that also meets with Morales, is this a way to bolster their opinion and bolster the support for them and their status, at least internationally. So, did they oppose Morales all along? Yes, they did. But did their weight on the national and international level grow because of U.S. attention? It certainly did. The last straw, or what set this incident off, was a meeting with the prefect of Santa Cruz and Ambassador Goldberg at a point in time where there had been a flow of verbal attacks against Morales. The Santa Cruz police chief had been, a Morales appointee, had been badly beaten by protesters, a civic group that's very closely linked to the Santa Cruz Civic Committee and to the prefecture's office, where there had been threats to not allow Morales appointees in the security forces, and many threats against the government. This was a time where there was a very high-profile public meeting where the U.S. didn't back down, where there was no statement after a series of attacks of central government institutions, and over a week of violence throughout the lowlands generated a great deal of chaos. There was no attempt on the U.S. to distance themselves from the conflict, no expression of concern of the severity of the conflict, no call to dialogue, although almost every other international government and organization and institution had done so. So there was the feeling that at a period of crisis and conflict and friction, that the decision would be best to have Ambassador Goldberg leave the country, with well-known implications here and there.
Now, can you talk about the violence itself in terms of how many people we know have been killed, who was behind that, how many are missing, and what does this mean for the future?
Well, it's interesting because in the urban areas where the protests were taking place and around the gas installations, it's fascinating to me because the lowland protesters used hydrocarbons as an excuse, and the royalties and the taxes, but at the same time they were blocking the flow of hydrocarbons largely to their own departments, and trying to block the flow by blowing up the pipeline or turning off the valves to Argentina and Brazil. And so, in effect, if they blocked it for a very, very long time, there would be no royalties left to fight over. So that in the urban areas, there was pressure on the Morales administration to make the choice: would a social government have the police fire into the crowd and become a repressive government, or would the social government have the security forces hold back and be shown as a weak government that couldn't protect its own institutions? And the government opted for the first option. But at the same time, what you saw were soldiers and policemen badly beaten and their weapons stolen, which also provoked friction within the security forces. The peak and the most violent activity was up here in the Pando department, which is it's a very large department, but with a population of only 60,000 people. It's very close to the Brazilian border. It has a very, very small non-indigenous population. It has an indigenous population that has been not only isolated but systematically blocked by a very racist government. The governor of that region, Leopoldo Fernandez, was a minister under President Banzer, is the largest landowner in the department, and very clearly linked to the groups that carried out the massacre of the campesinos. There was a clash between protesters from rural areas and departmental officials where there were deaths on both sides, but the great majority were indigenous people from rural areas, and we're talking about anywhere between 15 to 30 people dead. There are still approximately 100 people missing. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're all dead or they've been detained, but some of them are hiding. Some of the people have crossed the border. As our friend Adam Isaacson said, it was like Colombia. It was like Colombia, the high level of violence, people being run over repeatedly, crushing their bodies under the departmental government vehicles, a lack of human rights monitors, a lack of presence or access of anyone, as all the airports in the region had been closed. And something that led to the Morales government's declaration of a state of siege, which is a modified form of martial law in the region, and the entrance of the military and the arrest of the governor.
Right. Do we have any questions in terms of the background or context of this?
I was wondering if you could talk about the government's proposed plans for land reform. Is it land reform, or is it agrarian reform? I mean, with agrarian reform, it's not just, land redistribution, but it's also providing an access to credit so the farmers can actually take advantage of the larger crops and improve their yield.
Mm-hmm. I think that all of those things have been planned. The problem is that the staunch opposition to the first part, the redistribution, has been so strong and sustained that they haven't gotten beyond that. I think it's important to note with the violence in Santa Cruz that one of the first places that the pro-autonomy protesters destroyed was the land record office, and they burnt it to the ground with all the land tenured records within it. To me, that seems like, in the best case, very poor judgment, and in the worst case, a very guilty conscience, or that they had something to hide. So, one of the things that's pending in this draft of the Bolivian Constitution, which the opposition has systematically blocked because they link its passage with the success of a Morales initiative, is the ceiling on land tenure, which is going to a referendum for Bolivians to vote on. Is there going to be a ceiling at 5,000 hectares or 10,000 hectares? And actually most of the MAS delegates supported the 10,000 hectare ceiling. So we're talking about a redistribution with a ceiling of land that's extremely high in any case for redistribution. So we're not talking about things, with the opposition circulates, they're going to take away our house, we're not going to be able to have a yard, we're never going to be able to, play soccer again, all of these very dramatic things. So there is an integrated plan and an approach that they would like to carry out, but so far they've been blocked even from the implementation at the very most initial level of revising the records of field visits, of anything that would begin to be the first baby steps towards addressing this huge persisting problem.
past and where you see that playing into this conflict now, and what the relationship is now with World Bank, IMF, for example?
One, it's not an area that I work on specifically. Sarah could probably tell you much better than I do. The role of international financial institutions in the past have been incredible in terms of structural adjustments that have been imposed on Bolivia in the 80s and other times. In fact, Bolivia was a case study for the country that most closely followed these recommendations. They passed under the Sanchez de Lozada government a privatization initiative in which, for example, they changed all the labor legislation so that the legal retirement age in Bolivia was bumped from 55 to 65 at a time where the average life expectancy in Bolivia was 59 years. So it's fascinating that Bolivia, in that sense, the Bolivian governments had been such good students and so obedient and following all these rules and guidelines and forcing them basically down the throat of their population, I think was a very important test case in what they were recommending didn't help anyone. And so the weight of those institutions has diminished. The Morales administration has adopted a different stance, but they still have a role and they still have contact and there is still funding, but it's not as top-down as it was before. I think it's fascinating to look at the way in which the Morales administration has been promiscuous in terms of continuing to meet with everyone, continuing to talk with everyone. This is an administration that has broader international relations than any Bolivian democratic government in the past, and certainly the military government. It's a government that's been able to reestablish diplomatic relations with Chile, something no other government has been able to do. And so unless you're the ex-ambassador to the United States, my feeling is that the door in Bolivia is open and they want to talk to everyone and they want to maintain a rapport. And I think that this problem with Ambassador Goldberg was quite unfortunate, but it had a lot to do with the U.S.'s, one, a lack of understanding of the Morales government of how to engage the U.S. government, and a fear that the Bush administration could not be trusted. And this is a fear that was well earned over several centuries on the part of most Bolivians. At the same time, I think it was the U.S.'s inability to gauge its own impact and to shift away from a situation where in the past they got to decide everything and where now they need to be respectful and balanced. And that lag in understanding, or I would say perhaps a total lack of understanding, I think led to this extreme situation, because I think the Bolivians were giving out the messages very clearly and the U.S. wasn't capturing them. I feel that it's too bad that a policy of engagement, on the part of the State Department, and I would say concessions on the part of the Morales administration to get along well with the U.S. and the perception on the part of the U.S. that it's making concessions has been led to a period of tolerance, but not a period of learning, and not a period of greater understanding on the part of U.S. officials about the way things work in Bolivia and what Bolivia needs and what Bolivia certainly doesn't need. And I think that's a shame.
How do you think the dismissing of the American ambassador will affect our relations, U.S. relations with other countries in the area?
Well, I think it's interesting. Almost immediately, Hugo Chavez in Venezuela dismissed the U.S. ambassador. People have said to me it's clear that Morales and Chavez had gotten together and planned this systematically. My hypothesis is that Hugo Chavez was surprised that Morales had done something bolder than he did and quickly had to follow suit. I have nothing to back that up, but it's a hunch I have. I think very, very many people were surprised when almost immediately afterwards the president of Honduras refused to receive the credentials of the U.S. ambassador. And it leads me to believe, someone said recently in a meeting, it's really too bad that all Latin Americans have stopped liking U.S. assistance and U.S. democratic initiatives. And another colleague said, or maybe Latin Americans are starting to say what they've always thought. And I think that although diplomatically there was frustration and there was the feeling that it was an extreme measure, you didn't hear an outcry from the international community supporting the U.S., and I think what you saw was a flurry of international messages of support for the Morales administration and concern for the conflict, and that's something that the U.S. never did. And so I think that with this incident and this friction and a response from the U.S., which one would hope they would have taken the moral high ground, there was a harsh, conditioned, punitive response which pretty much confirmed Morales' worst fear. These are the same people we dealt with before. And that the U.S., by flexing its muscle in the way it did, came to the sad realization that it lost a lot more ground than they thought they had.
Any other questions?
Oh, sorry. I really wasn't going to ask.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. Well, there are a number of things that people in the U.S. can do to get involved or learn more. One of those things is they can go to Bolivia. There's a delegation leaving in November from Witness for Peace. If you go to witnessforpeace.org, you can sign up for that delegation and see a lot of this stuff firsthand and meet with a lot of these people. And they can also learn more from you, your website. Can you give people your contact info and what else people can do?
The Andean Information Network website is www.ain-bolivia.org, and there's something there that you can sign up. We send out periodic updates. We're happy to answer specific questions. I think that writing members of Congress is something that's very, very useful. There's been a new interest in Bolivia as a result of this bilateral clash, and unfortunately, sometimes when you have members of Congress that haven't paid attention to Bolivia before, and this is their focus, I am suggesting, much like after people have to buy a gun, those that would choose to have a wait period and cooling off before anybody sends off another document. And it's interesting because Bolivians across the board, when you ask them, regardless of their feelings of President Morales, their feelings are less is more in Bolivia, and we'd like less attention, and we'd like less assistance, and we'd like more breathing space. And so I think it's fascinating that the U.S. is very frustrated because there's rejection of their programs and rejection of USAID's presence, yet in the past they've wanted to maintain that there and are resentful that they aren't appreciated because they're doing so much for Bolivia, and what Bolivians also want is for there to be less of this help and more of an ability to chart their own course and make decisions. And so I think the more that we can give that message and the more we can give the message that, not necessarily a lot of U.S. attention is the best thing, that we've already made a lot of progress.
Well, thank you. On behalf of the Institute for Policy Studies and the Washington Office in Latin America, I want to thank Catherine for being here today, and thank you all for coming.
Thank you.